Chapter 20. The gardener's story continued. The new superstition spread first over Syria and Africa. It went over the seaports where the filthy rabble swarm, and penetrating into Italy, infected at first the courtesans and the slaves, and then made rapid progress among the middle classes of the towns. But for a long while the countryside remained undisturbed, as in the past the villagers consecrated a pine tree to Diana, and sprinkled it every year with the blood of a young boar. They propitiated their lairs with the sacrifice of a sow, and offered to Bacchus, benefactor of mankind, a kid of dazzling whiteness. Or, if they were too poor for this, at least they had a little wine and a little flour from the vineyard and from the fields for their household gods. We had taught them that it sufficed to approach the altar with clean hands, and that the gods rejoiced over a modest offering. Nevertheless, the reign of Yahweh proclaimed its advent in 100 places by its extravagances. The Christians burnt books, overthrew temples, set fire to the towns, and carried on the ravages as far as the deserts. There are thousands of unhappy beings turning their fury against themselves, lacerated their sides with points of steel, and from the whole earth the sighs of voluntary victims rose up to God like songs of praise. My shadowy retreat could not escape for long from the fury of their madness. On the summit of the hill which overlooked the olive woods, brightened daily with the sounds of my flute, had stood since the earliest days of Pax Romana, a small marble temple, round as the huts of our forefathers. It had no walls, but on a base of 7 steps, 16 columns rose in a circle with the acanthus on the capitals, bearing a cupola of white tiles. This cupola sheltered a statue of Love, fashioning his bow, the work of an Athenian sculptor. The child seemed to breathe. Joy was welling from his lips. All his limbs were harmonious and polished. I honored this image of the most powerful of all the gods, and I taught the villagers to bear him as an offering, to bear to him as an offering a cup crowned with verbena and filled with wine 2 summers old. One day, when seated as my custom was the feet of the god, pondering precepts and songs, an unknown man, wild-looking with unkempt hair, approached the temple, sprang at one, bound up the marble steps, and with savage glee exclaimed, "Die, poisoner of souls, and joy and beauty perish with you." He spoke thus, and drawing an axe from his girdle, raised it against the god. I stayed his arm, I threw him down, and trampled him under my feet. "Demon," he cried desperately, "suffer me to overturn this idol, and you may slay me afterwards." I heeded not his atrocious plea, but leaned with all my might on his chest, which cracked under my knee, and squeezing his throat with my 2 hands, I strangled the impious one, while he lay there with purple face and lolling tongue. At the feet of the smiling god I went to purify myself at the sacred stream. Then, leaving this land, now the prey of the Christian, I passed through Gaul and gained the banks of the Saone, whither Dionysus had, in days gone by, carried the vine. The god of the Christians had not yet been claimed to this happy people. They worshipped for its beauty a leafy beech tree, whose honored branches swept the ground, and they hung fillets of wool thereon. They also worshipped a sacred stream and set up images of clay in a dripping grotto. They made offering of little cheeses and a bowl of milk to the nymphs of the woods and the mountains. But soon an apostle of sorrow was sent to them by the new god. He was drier than a smoked fish, although attenuated with fasting and watching. He taught with unabated ardor all manner of gloomy mysteries. He loved suffering and thought it was good. His anger fell upon all that is beautiful, comely, and joyous. The sacred tree fell beneath his hatchet. He hated the nymphs because they were beautiful, and he flung imprecations at them when their shining limbs gleamed among the leaves at evening. And he held my melodious flute at aversion. The poor wretch thought that there were certain forms of words wherewith to put to flight the deathless spirits that dwell in the cold groves and in the depths of the woods and on the tops of the mountains. He thought to conquer us with a few drops of water, over which he had pronounced certain words and made certain gestures. The nymphs, to avenge themselves, appeared to him at nightfall, and inflamed him with desire, which the foolish knave thought animal. Then they fled, their laughter scattered like grain over the fields, while their victim lay tossing with burning limbs on his couch of leaves. Thus did the divine nymphs laugh at exorcisers and mock the wicked and their sordid chastity. The apostle did not do as much harm as he wished, because his teaching was given to the simple souls living in obedience to nature, and because the mediocrity of most of mankind is such that they gain but little from the principles inculcated to them. The little wood in which I dwelt belonged to a Gaul of a senatorial family who retained some traces of Latin eloquence. He loved his young freed woman and shared with her his bed of broidered purple. His slaves cultivated his garden and his vineyard. He was a poet and sang, in imitation of Pausanias, Venus whipping her son with roses. Although a Christian, he offered me milk, fruit, and vegetables, as if I were the genius of the place. In return, I charmed his idle moments with the music of my flute, and I gave him happy dreams. In fact, these peaceful Gauls knew very little of Iave and his son. Now behold fires looming on the horizon, and ashes driven by the wind fall within our forest glades. Peasants come driving a long file of wagons along the roads, urging their flocks before them. Cries of terror rose from the villages. The Burgundians are upon us. Now, one horseman is seen, lance in hand, clad in shining bronze, his long red hair falling in two plaits on his shoulders. Then come the 2, then 20, then thousands, wild and blood-stained old men and children. They put to the sword. Even aged grandams, whose gray hairs cleave to the soles of the slaughterer's boots, mingled with the brains of babes newborn. My young Gaul and his young freed woman, stained with their blood, the couch broidered with the narcissi. The barbarians burn the basilicas to roast their oxen whole, shatter the amphora, and drain the wine in the mud of the flooded cellars. Their women accompany them, huddled, half naked, in their war chariots. When the Senate, the dwellers in the cities, and the leaders of the churches had perished in the flames, the Burgundians, sotted with wine, lay down to slumber beneath the arcades of the Forum. 2 weeks later, one of them might have been seen smiling in his shaggy beard at the little child whom, on the threshold of their dwelling, the fair-haired spouse gathers in her arms, while another, kindling the fire of his forge, hammers out his iron with measured stroke. Another sings beneath the oak tree to his assembled comrades of the gods and heroes of his race, and yet others spread out for sale stones fallen from heaven, aurochs, horns, and amulets, and the former inhabitants of the country, regaining courage little by little, crept from the woods where they had fled for refuge, and returned to rebuild their burnt-down cabins, plow their fields, and prune their vines. Once more life resumed its normal course, but those times were the most wretched that mankind had yet experienced. The barbarians swarmed over the whole empire. Their ways were uncouth, and as they nurtured feelings of vengeance and greed, they firmly believed in the ransom of sin. The fable of Iave and his son pleased them, and they believed it all the more easily in that it was taught to them by the Romans, whom they knew to be wiser than themselves, and to whose arts and mode of life they yielded secret admiration. Alas, the heritage of Greece and Rome had fallen into the hands of fools. All knowledge was lost. In those days it was held to be a great merit to sing among the choir, and those who remembered a few sentences from the Bible passed for prodigious geniuses. There were still poets, as they were birds, but their verse went lame in every foot. The ancient demons, the good genii of mankind, shorn their honors, driven forth, pursued, hunted down, remained hidden in the woods. There, if they still showed themselves to men, they adopted to hold them in awe. A terrible face, a red, green, or black skin, baleful eyes, an enormous mouth fringed with boar's teeth, horns, a tail, and sometimes a human face on their bellies. The nymphs remained fair, and the barbarians ignorant. By the winsome names they bore in other days, called them fairies, and, imputing to them a capricious character and puerile tastes, both feared and loved them. We had suffered a grievous fall, and our ranks were sadly thinned. Nevertheless, we did not lose courage in maintaining a laughing aspect and benevolent spirit. We were, in those direful days, the real friends of mankind. Perceiving that the barbarians grew daily less somber and less ferocious, we lent ourselves to the task of conversing with them under all sorts of disguises. We incited them with 1,000 precautions, and by prudent circumlocutions, not to acknowledge the old Iave as an infallible master, not blindly to obey his orders, and not to fear his menaces. When need was, we had recourse to magic. We exhorted them unceasingly to study nature and to strive to discover the traces of ancient wisdom. Those warriors from the north, rude they were acquainted with some mechanical arts. They thought they saw combats in the heavens. The sound of the harp drew tears from their eyes, and perchance they had souls capable of greater things than the degenerate Gauls and Romans, whose lands they had invaded. They knew not how to hew stone or to polish marble, but they caused porphyry and columns to be brought from Rome and from Ravenna. Their chief men took for their seal a gem engraved by a Greek in the days when beauty reigned supreme. They raised walls with bricks cunningly arranged like ears of corn, and succeeded in building quite pleasing-looking churches with cornices upheld by consoles, depicting grim faces and heavy capitals, whereon were represented monsters devouring one another. We taught them letters and sciences. The mouthpiece of their god, one Gerbert, took lessons in physics, arithmetic, and music with us. It was said that he had sold his soul. Centuries passed, and man's ways remained violent. It was a world given up to fire and blood. The successors of the studious Gerbert, not content with the possession of souls, the prophets won gangs, thereby are lighter than air, wished to possess bodies also. They pretended that their universal and prescriptive monarchy was held from a fisherman on the lake of Tiberias. One of them thought for a moment to prevail over the loutish Germanus, successor to Augustus, but finally the spiritual had to come to terms with the temporal, and the nations were torn between two opposing masters. Nations took shape amid horrible tumult. On every side were wars, famines, and internecine conflicts. Since they attributed the innumerable ills that fell upon them to their God, they called him the most good, not by way of irony, but because to them the best was he who smote the hardest. In those days of violence, to give myself leisure for study, I adopted a role which may surprise you, but which was exceedingly wise. Between the Saone and the mountains of Carolais, where the cattle pasture, there lies a wooded hill, sloping gently down to fields watered by a clear stream. There stood a monastery celebrated throughout the Christian world. I hid my cloven feet under a robe and became a monk in this abbey, where I lived peacefully, sheltered from the men at arms who, friend or foe alike, showed themselves equally exacting. Man, who had relapsed into childhood, had all his lessons to learn over again. Brother Luke, whose cell was next to mine, studied the habits of animals and taught us that the weasel conceives her young within her ear. I culled simples in the fields, wherewith to soothe the sick, who, until then, were made by way of treatment to touch the relics of saints. In the abbey were several demons similar to myself, whom I recognized by their cloven feet and by their kindly speech. We joined forces in our endeavors to polish the rough mind of the monks. While the little children played at hopscotch under the abbey walls, our friends, the monks, devoted themselves to another game equally unprofitable, at which nevertheless I joined them, for one must kill time. That, when one comes to think of it, is the sole business of life. Our game was a game of words which pleased our coarse yet subtle minds, yet school fulminating against school, and put all Christendom in an uproar. We formed ourselves in two opposing camps. One camp maintained that before there were apples, there was the apple. That before there were popinjays, there was the popinjay. That before there were lewd and greedy monks, there was the monk, lewdness and greed. That before there were feet and before there were posteriors in the world, the kick and the posterior must have had an existence for all eternity in the bosom of God. The other camp replied that, on the contrary, apples gave man the idea of the apple, popinjays the idea of the popinjay, monks the idea of the monk, and greed and lewdness, and that kick in the posterior existed only after being duly given and received. The players grew heated and came to fisticuffs. I was an adherent of the second party, which satisfied my reason better, and which was in fact condemned by the Council of Soissons. Meanwhile, not content with fighting among themselves, vassal against suzerain, suzerain against vassal, the great lords took it into their hands to go and fight in the East. They said, as well as I can remember, that they were going to deliver the tomb of the Son of God. They said so, but their adventures and covetous spirit excited them to go forth and seek lands, women, slaves, gold, myrrh, and incense. These expeditions, need it be said, proved disastrous, but our thick-headed compatriots brought back with them the knowledge of certain crafts and oriental arts and a taste for luxury. Henceforth, we had less difficulty in making them work, and in putting them in the way of inventions. We built wonderfully beautiful churches with daringly pierced arches, lancet-shaped windows, high towers, thousands of pointed spires, which, rising in the sky towards the Ave, bore at one at the same time the prayers of the humble and the threats of the proud. For it was all as much our doing as the work of men's hands, and it was a strange sight to see men and demons working together at a cathedral, each one sawing, polishing, collecting stones, graving on capital, and on cornice, nettles, thorns, thistles, wild parsley, and wild strawberry, carving faces of virgins and saints, and weird figures of serpents, fishes with donkeys' heads, apes scratching their buttocks, each one, in fact, putting his own particular talent, mocking, sublime, grotesque, modest, or audacious, into the work of making it all a harmonious cacophony, a rapturous anthem of joy and sorrow, a babble of victory. At our instigation, the carvers, the goldsmiths, the enamelers, accomplished marvels, and all the sumptuary arts flourished at once. There were the silks at Lyons, tapestries at Arras, linen at Rheims, cloth at Rouen. The good merchant rode on their palfreys to the fairs, bearing pieces of velvet and brocade, embroideries, orfraies, jewels, vessels of silver, and illuminated books. Strollers and players set up their trestles in the churches and the public squares, and represented according to their lights simple chronicles of heaven, earth, and hell. Women decked themselves in splendid raiment and lisped of love. In the spring, when the sky was blue, nobles and peasants were possessed with the desire to make merry in flower-strewn meadows. The fiddler tuned his instrument, and ladies, knights, and the Marcels, townsfolk, villagers, and maidens, holding hands, began to dance. But suddenly, war, pestilence, and famine entered the circle, and death, tearing the violin from the fiddler's hands, led the dance. Fire devoured village and monastery. The men at arms hanged the peasants on the signposts and the crossroads when they were unable to pay ransom, and bound pregnant women to tree trunks, where at night the wolves came and devoured the fruit within their womb. The poor people lost their senses, sometimes peace being reestablished and good times come again. They were seized with mad, unreasoning terror, abandoned their homes, and rushed hither and thither in troops, half naked, tearing themselves with iron hooks and singing, I do not accuse Eave and his son of all this evil. Many ill things occurred without him, and even in spite of him. But where I recognize the instigation of the all-good, as they called him, was in the custom instituted by his pastors and established throughout Christendom, of burning, to the sound of bells and the singing of psalms, both men and women who taught by the demons professed concerning this God opinions of their own. And people should be allowed to have their own opinions. But it would definitely be wrong to burn people to death for having different opinions, or likewise to hurt them for having different, merely just having different opinions. But we have to say that, there's a difference between punishment and abuse. That's just, well, I don't know if most people understand that nowadays, but there is. And certainly there would be consequences, and it does, atonement and other stuff does work, but not per se in the Christian sense. It's not really. And musical instruments, like in the Bible, there's reason to think that musical instruments are wrong and forbidden. I'm not sure whether I wrote that paper and then did a video. I'm not sure if it's on the channel. I'll let you know. But I did do something that kind of pointed out this scriptural verses that talked about that. But it's apparent. Well, first of all, that these various things that are worshipped. This book is good in the midst of these things, are the fallen angels, the demons, whatever you want to call them. And they're more or less, it's not so much you do this big thing or not. It's just do something, for them. And yeah, it's interesting that the churches started doing some of the very same things that their own scriptures said not to. The tall spires and stuff like this. The musical instruments and no philosophy, but then their philosophy kind of undid them when they decided they were going to do something else. You know what I mean? The elementary ideas. Yeah, I don't side with the latter one. Like, first there was stuff, and then we looked at their qualities, rather than there was not, a pre-existence of the qualities of existence. Sure, but not quite in the elementary idea thing.